The first set of items on the primary ballot will be the list of candidates for each of the respective parties. So you'll pick a Republican primary ballot or a Democratic primary ballot, or you also have an option to pick an issues only or nonpartisan ballot. And then after the candidates, voters will see the list of questions. And there's a list of questions that come from the state parties. And in some counties, the county parties have also added a set of questions. And so you'll see those questions, and then after the questions, you'll see the third part of the ballot, which is the nonpartisan portion, which includes the judicial candidates, any special elections, and any issues that might be on the ballot.
So talking about these questions in particular, what are they? Explain these questions and why they're on the ballot.
Georgia election rules allow political parties the ability to put advisory questions on the ballot. They have no public policy impact, but with that said, they have some functions. So first, parties may use the questions to try to drive up turnout in a primary election. Many of the questions are what we would call red meat sort of questions that excite voters of a particular party. And so one of the strategies might be to try to drive up turnout in the primary by offering these kind of red meat sort of issue questions where if you look at just the candidates, as an ordinary voter, you might not be very enthusiastic about turning out to vote because there may not be a lot to vote on. But you may get excited about one or two of the questions, and it may cause you to turn out. It's important to have a high, to try to get more people to turn out in the primary, to just show that there's interest in the party and there's excitement in the party. Because a really low turnout in the primary election can be a bad sign for the general election in terms of the party regulars aren't really excited. So the questions may drive turnout a bit. I would argue that those questions, though, aren't going to have any impact. That it's more, those are the red meat issues that drive maybe voters to turn out in the primary. But legislatively, I doubt if they'll have much impact.
How would you advise voters to decode what these questions really mean?
Well, you have to go in knowing that these questions are worded by party officials to elicit a desired response. So you just have to be critical and kind of dissect the question and figure out what it's really getting at. So the Democratic ballot focuses a lot on the economic issues like raising the minimum wage to a living wage, expanding Medicaid, which has been a big issue for Democrats across the country. It tends to focus, and also they have a question about tenant right, expanding the rights of tenants and renters. So you tend to see those types of issues on the Democratic ballot. Of course, abortion is a big issue for Democrats as well.
What about on the Republican ballot? What kind of topics are we probably looking at?
Tax issues. There's a question about the flat tax. And then there's also questions about the border and immigration security. And one question in particular that interests me is there's a question about converting the Republican primary into a closed primary, which I guess would also, if you change the state law on how we do primaries in Georgia, it would probably affect Democrats as well. We have an open primary in the state of Georgia where if you're a registered voter, you can vote in either the Republican or Democratic primaries. But Republicans across the country have been pushing to close primaries. And what that means is that you would have to register as a Republican or a Democrat about 30 days before the primary in order to vote in the primary. And that's
to cut down on strategic voting, like Democrats picking the Republican ballot?
It's meant to curtail kind of I think we use the term crossover voting, where you have like Democrats strategically voting like in the Republican primary for the weaker candidate. Democrats actually used this successfully in Michigan in 2022, where they got Democrats to vote in the Republican primary for the weaker or more extreme candidates. So Republicans didn't really like that, of course. And so you see now in places like Missouri, Ohio, and South Carolina efforts in those open primary states to close them down, where you have to register to vote as a Republican ahead of time. And what's interesting is this question was on the 2022 primary ballot, or I'm sorry, 2020 primary ballot. And it actually failed. It's very unlikely you see no winning. You have a yes or no option. But when this was put on the 2020 Republican primary ballot, 52% of Republican primary voters in 2020 voted no. They did not want a closed primary. So it's curious, why is it appearing again 4 years later in 2024? It seems like there's an effort potentially in the state legislature to start pushing a closed primary, but there needs to be a justification for it. And so if they could win that question, get a majority to vote yes, we want a closed primary, that might lead to legislation being introduced. I don't know if it's going to go anywhere. I don't think it will, but that's my sense is, why would you put the same question on the ballot after it failed once? And it just seems like there does seem to be this strong push to among some Republicans to close down their primary.
Generally, because these are yes or no questions, why is it so rare for a question to get a majority no matter which ballot?
Because they're written in leading sorts of ways to elicit a certain response, because the party wants you to vote yes, to agree with the statement, and so should Georgia move to a living wage rather than a minimum wage, so among Democrats you're going to see a large majority say that, but what's interesting is you do see variation in the yes vote across questions. Some will get over 95%, while others may get 80 or 75%. And so that indicates that there's some division within a political party. So I'd be interested in the Democratic primary to see the difference between the abortion question, and there's also a question about banning assault weapons. How big of a difference? And so it gives party strategists some information about what issues to focus on. Because they may think, this is going to be a big issue, but then they see, only 75% of people voted yes as compared to this other question where 95% of party regulars in the primary voted yes. So it may give them some information about what issues to target in the general election to drive turnout.
So this is kind of taking the temperature of the party's voters.
Yeah.
What comes of these questions? Anything, any legislation, any elected official, anything that becomes binding law in any way?
No, there's nothing of any real policy significance. The only one that I'm watching is really the closed primary for the Republicans. I think that has some legs in the state legislature next year. This vote in and of itself doesn't change anything. But if it's a strong yes vote, then I think you might see a bill introduced to try to close the primary. So I think that there is potential for some legislative significance down the road.